Welcome to the Business of Soil Health. I'm Patrick Smith, the founder of Soil Upside.
And I'm Sammy Telleton, the co-founder of FarmRaise. We're really thrilled today to be joined by Keith Berns, a farmer, Nebraska native, and the visionary business owner of Green Cover Seed. Keith, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks, Sammy. It's great to be here. And Patrick, it's nice to meet you and to be here as well. Thank you.
Likewise. Thanks, Keith.
We're going to get really deep into some cover crop economics today and definitely go into the weeds as much as we can with you, Keith.
We don't like to go into the weeds. We'll go into the cover crops.
Heck yeah. We'll go into the green cover, the cover crop. But before we do that, we'd love to hear more about the origins of Green Cover Seed and your own story as you kind of, developed this incredible business in the cover crop industry. So tell us about it. How did Green Cover Seed come to be?
Yeah, sure. That's always a fun place to start. So my brother and I grew up here on the farm. So we're in south central Nebraska, outside of a little town called Bladen, about an hour south of Grand Island. And this is a family farm. We grew up here, grew up farming with our family. I went to college and got an ag teaching degree, and I taught school for 10 years. My brother got a degree in production ag and came back right away. But after 10 years of teaching, my dad was ready to retire. So my family moved back to the farm. And, we farmed together. And Brian was already experimenting with a lot of no-till techniques. This would be back in the late 80s and through the early 90s. He was experimenting with a lot of no-till. And when I came back in the late 90s, we transitioned 100% to all no-till. And we were very involved in the no-till organizations, no-till in the plains in particular. And so we knew Gabe Brown and we knew Jill Clapperton, and we knew all these people prior to ever starting Green Cover through the no-till organizations. That was a big benefit right off the bat because we were so involved in that. And then in 2006, there was a man by the name of Ademir Caligari from Brazil, and he came into Salina, Kansas to the No-Till on the Plains conference, and his keynote address was showing all of us these multi-species, super diverse cover crop mixes that they were using in Brazil. And all of the benefits that they were getting, the benefits to the cattle, the benefits to the land, the benefits to the biology. And we were just fascinated because we hadn't really seen that. People were doing cover crops in so much as we'll plant radishes or we'll plant clover, or we put sorghum sedan out there, but nobody was really doing these really diverse, complex mixes like what Ademir was showing them doing in Brazil. Well, of course, Brazil, completely different climate, completely different context. So we thought it was a cool story, but we still weren't sure that it would work. So that was 2006. It was the winter of 2006. So Gabe Brown and Jay Fuhrer, they were at the same meeting. They heard the same talk by Ademir. They took that information, they took that back to Burleigh County, North Dakota, and they put out these plots where they had individual strips of cover crops and then these big diverse blends. And these are pretty famous pictures. A lot of people have probably seen these pictures. The summer of 2006 in Bismarck was brutal, incredibly dry. So they planted these things at the end of May, and then the series of pictures was taken about 60 days later, the end of July. And they'd gotten less than an inch of rain during that time period. They had less than 3 inches of rain for that whole year. And as you would expect, those monoculture plots where anything was planted by itself was just burned up. Just brown. It looked dead. There was just hardly anything there. But where they mix these things together in these diverse mixes, it looked amazing. Now, it wasn't the picture of health and, this is the greatest, but it was growing and it was 3 feet tall and they had forage out there for their animals to graze, whereas anything in a monoculture was just burned up. And it was truly groundbreaking, if you will, because I don't know that any of us understood what was going on because we also, they shared these pictures and they had bus tours and the whole works. And it's like, what is going on there? What is causing this, to this kind of growth and this diversity where all of the individual components just burn up? And so we saw that, and my brother and I were like, wow, yeah, we should try something like that too. So in 2008, we wrote a SARE grant, and Sammy, this is how we first got to know you, because you were working with Rob Meyer, and SARE has been a great program. So we got a small farmer rancher grant. We got like $5,000, and we bought moisture sensors because we wanted to kind of do the same thing that Gabe and Jay did in North Dakota, but we wanted to do it right here in Nebraska. And so we planted about 20 different cover crops in monoculture strips, and then we combined them into 2 or 3 really diverse mixes. And then we put these moisture sensors in at 1 foot, 2 foot, and 3 foot levels. Hooked them up to data loggers, and this is back in 2008. And so we don't have this sophisticated sensor technology we have now, but it wasn't bad. We hooked it up to data loggers. It took a reading every hour, and then we could download that and get a really nice graph. So we knew exactly where our moisture levels were in each of those individual plots. Now, unlike Gabe and Jay, that was super dry and they just really saw things burn up, we actually had some decent moisture that summer. So we didn't see anything really burn up. But what the charts told us, what the data told us, is that anything planted in a monoculture had used the majority of the moisture that we had received. We got good growth, but it took most of the water to do it. And by the end of the season, I think we monitored through mid-November, a lot of those plots where the monoculture cover crop was growing had pulled the moisture levels down probably to a level that we weren't necessarily comfortable with. But where we had them in the diverse mixtures, we can't explain exactly what happened, but it showed much more efficient use of the water. In fact, the readings from the diverse mixes weren't significantly different than the readings from the bare wheat stubble. And so there's something happening biologically when those diverse community of plants is growing in a much more cooperative environment versus it's a highly competitive environment in a monoculture setting, because everything, same rooting depth, same nutrient needs, same water needs, same biological needs. There's no ability to share because everybody's the same and you're competing for the exact same nutrients at the exact same time. Whereas these diverse communities, there's a lot of ability to share nutrients, water, resources, all these things, biology back and forth. And so we saw that in these diverse mixes, we felt like the water question could be answered. And yes, we could utilize this in our dry land system, because at that time we were primarily dry land here in Nebraska, and we get 25 inches of rainfall. Like Gabe and Jay up there, they're 16 to 18 inches probably. But even at that, we don't want to jeopardize the next cash crop by having this cover crop out there. So that was the big question we were trying to answer. But we also saw, we planted these diverse mixes in the rest of this 80-acre field, and the cattle that we grazed out on there did incredible. I mean, they came off the cover crop. I mean, they had turnips hanging out of their mouth. These cows were fat. I mean, it looked like they'd been in a feedlot, and they hadn't seen a kernel of grain. It was just simply the extremely high nutritional plane of these diverse cover crop mixes. It was a great balanced diet. And they came off there. Their calves were heavy. It was just, when we saw that, it's like, wow, this is really great. And so based on those findings and the fact that it was hard to find 20 different types of cover crop seed at the time, that's when we decided maybe we can sell this stuff. And so we started Green Cover the next year in 2009. And from the very beginning, we have focused on diversity. We focused on the diverse mix, because of what we saw that first year. We saw in North Dakota with Gabe and with Jay in a very dry year, but we saw the same thing in our data in a relatively wet summer here in Nebraska. And so that convinced us that the diversity aspect of this could make this be something that could fit into a dry land situation. And what we've come to find is it can fit into almost any situation when it's done properly. The right species are selected and the timing and the management is applied correctly, it can work about anywhere. So that was 2009. We sold enough cover crop seed for about 1,000 acres is all. And a lot of that was our own ground. We were basically just getting started, but fast forward to the last few years here, we'll sell cover crop seed for well over 1 million acres now.
Wow.
I'm just my brother and I and a few of the kids running the business. part-time out of our shop to where now we have 55 employees across a couple of locations, and we're shipping to all 50 states and have all kinds of bins and buildings and all kinds of equipment. So we've invested heavily in the infrastructure that it takes to do this. So in the meantime, we've continued to farm. We farm, about 1,800 acres here in South Central Nebraska, and still growing corn and beans like a lot of people around us, but trying to do it in a more regenerative fashion, and are incorporating the growing of some cover crop seed into the system as well. So that's kind of our story. We're continue to learn every day. It's been a steep learning curve, going from, running a farm to running a business with, managing people and managing inventory. I mean, man, if you can master those two things, you'll succeed in any business. I don't care what it is, but it's hard. It's hard, but those are the daily challenges.
Keith, it feels like we've just gotten a little bit of the apostolic succession story of regenerative agriculture. So I appreciate that backstory. It's really wonderful.
Yeah.
And I'll just put one more plug in for the SARE program. Even though it wasn't a huge grant, it was like $5,000. It incentivizes, and Rob Myers likes to tell this story all the time, because I think I said in one of the interviews, because we just had troubles getting going doing these plots. But once we got that money, I think I told Rob, it was like a gun to our head. We had to do it because now we had this money. We were required to submit a report. So it forced us to do it. And we're so glad we did. And so now I actually serve on the administrative council for SARE. So trying to give back, to a program that gave a lot to us.
I love that you brought SARE up because it is an incredible program, Keith. Your story is a very good example of that, where you can get federal grant dollars that are written into the Farm Bill to go do research on the farm. And then, like you said, you do have to submit a report. But the cool thing is that report goes into a database that is publicly available. Yeah. Anyone can read about it. So just thank you for participating, and what a great tie into one of the financial levers to help incentivize some of this work on the ground.
Yeah. And I think we would all agree that there is a lot of grant money just totally wasted, throughout the whole system. SARE, I think the money is well spent. The projects are well done. And I love the fact that a lot of it is getting out to the farmer rancher level. The applications aren't super hard to do, which makes it easy for just a regular guy like us to apply and to do it. And so lots of resources to help. So yeah, if you're interested in that, I would encourage you to every state has a SARE coordinator that can help you with this process.
Before we get into some of the producer dynamics and some of the economics, I'm curious to hear more about your business. First off, congrats on building the business that you have. You clearly play a really important seminal role in the advancement of regenerative ag and adoption of cover crops. The events that you run, super well known, the advice that you give, all of the presence that you have out there. So really wonderful. I'm curious, it seems to me as an outsider on the cover crop industry, it seems to me like cover crops are one of the only growth industries inside regenerative agriculture right now. So I'm curious if you can talk to the growth that you've seen since you started 2006, 2007?
Yeah, 2009 was the first year we sold seed. Yeah, it certainly has grown. There for a while it was growing very fast, but hey, when you're only selling a little amount, it doesn't take a lot to double and then have 50% growth, all those big numbers. Where you're some decent size, it takes a lot to move the needle very much. And so, it's kind of leveled off to some extent. And, there's a number of factors that's attributed to, other competition, weather related things. A lot of it is just economics right now. There's so little margin in farming that, decisions to spend money are really hard. And so it's just, a harder and harder thing for guys to, make that commitment to do those things, especially for the ones that are on the fence that haven't seen it work. It's harder to convince them. The ones that have done it and have seen it, and especially the cattle guys, that's a pretty easy sell right now. But certainly, when you look at the numbers, the number of cover crops, the number of acres that have cover crops on them continues to grow, but it's still a really small number. There's approximately 300 million acres of crop ground in the US right now. And, maybe 7% of that will have a cover crop on it. It's still a pretty low number. It's probably, 20, 22 million. It's a little hard to get all that information, but it's probably somewhere in that neighborhood. And that's probably double what it was from when we started. So great, we're moving, but if you're only at 6 or 7%, man, there's a lot of upside potential there yet. So we think that there's a lot of room to grow, but in order for that to happen, there's a lot of infrastructure things that, it would be a disaster if demand doubled overnight, because we just physically wouldn't have the seed. We wouldn't have the cleaning capacity. We wouldn't have the infrastructure to do that. So, we'd love to see a nice steady, 12, 15% growth every year. Because the other thing is, I mentioned it's all about managing people and managing inventory. And if we expect to have a big growth, and so we go out and we grow a whole bunch of seed, well, now all of a sudden I've got $10 million worth of seed in inventory. And then if that demand doesn't come, well, now I'm sitting on $10 million worth of seed inventory that I'm paying interest on, and I got no place to ship it. And it's a volatile product. It's the time clock is ticking. It doesn't get better as I store it. And so, for that reason, there's a lot of people hesitant to expand too quickly, just simply because it's a capital intensive game. And if you get stuck on the wrong side of some inventory, that takes a little while to work out of. When we first got started, the old timers in the seed industry said, son, there's two things that will bankrupt you in this business. One is too much inventory, and the other one's not enough. I think he's exactly right. Because you can't, you don't have it, but man, if you got too much of it and can't sell it, that's not good either.
That goes to my next question, which is, are you supply or demand constrained?
I would say right now it's mostly demand constrained. We've got plenty of people that would grow cover crop seed for us. And part of it is we're paying a premium. We don't expect people to grow cover crop seed for the same value proposition as what they're growing commodities. We don't want that, because we want the better growers. And, we'll sell 30 to 35 million pounds of seed every year, and probably close to 2/3 of that we're producing through our grower network. And our grower network is customers, and most of all these people are customers of ours first, that are really good farmers. But just because you're a really good farmer does not mean you're a good seed grower, because there's a big difference. It's a different mindset. You got to have some different facilities. You got to you got to have a higher attention to detail, some of those things. So we found the people that are both good farmers and good seed growers. And then, we'll pay them a premium to grow seed for us instead of just growing a commodity. And that is done partially at a decent size risk to them, because many of the things that we're asking them to grow, barley and triticale and rye, and peas and buckwheat and sunflowers and vetch and clover, things like that, they can't get crop insurance on that because they have no production history. And so a lot of times when they're doing this, they're stepping out into a little bit of a zone of uncomfortability, because, I've got really good APH on my corn. All I want to grow is corn. That's the mindset of a lot of people. And I understand that. But for them to go out and do something different and something new involves some risk. So there's got to be more reward in order for that to happen, but it still involves risk. And so, we have to navigate through all that. So we feel like we've got enough growers. We could, if we knew the demand would be there, I think we could double the production on almost everything that we're selling easily within a year, certainly within 2, but again, that's going to take a big outlay of cash and a big outlay of investment into, infrastructure and all those things. So certainly we can ramp up the supply if we're confident that the demand is going to be there.
What would it take to give you that confidence? What are the signals you would be looking for, Keith?
God, I mean, that's a great question. A couple of years ago, we thought with all of this, climate smart commodity grants, and they're putting $3 billion into this and all this money into that, we thought, wow, we're really going to see a good bump in in demand. I don't know that we ever really saw that. Part of that is a lot of those programs didn't really get off the ground very quickly. And then some of those got pulled back because they weren't getting enough money out to the farmers. And so, it's a little hard to base it just simply on an incentive program where, hey, we're going to pay you to do this. Certainly that's going to be a little bit of a bump, but until the farmers see that the practices themselves not only pay for themselves, but have a return on the investment, apart from any incentive, any outside incentive, those incentives just need to be, gravy on top, or, the whipped cream on top of the sundae. That has to just be above and beyond. They have to be convinced that these practices are going to be a good investment for the short term and for the long term, because I think most people understand that it is for the long term, building organic matter, reducing erosion, increasing infiltration. Pretty easy for people to go, yeah, that's a great long-term strategy, but that doesn't help me right now. And so much of the land is being farmed by people that don't own it. They can't afford to care about the long-term strategy, because they might not have that next year or 2 years or 3 years or 5 years. And so it's great to talk about those things, but if it doesn't pay for itself in the short term, it's really difficult to get the farmer to make that decision to go ahead and do that. And so, what would the signals be? I think it would have to just simply be, we had so much sales demand this year that we completely sold out of everything, and guys are saying, put me on a list for next year. I mean, it would have to be something like that. I don't think it would be enough for just some sort of new regulation or some sort of new program that says, we're going to invest this money in this sector. Because number one, you don't know what the timing of that looks like. And then you just never know how that's going to get out to the ground with the farmers. There's so many levels of bureaucracy and red tape and, regulations between the source and the end user that you just never know. And so I think it would just have to come from an increased demand for this year that we are confident that is not just a one-time thing, but it is going to continue to grow and build.
Yeah, I hope we get that signal soon for everyone's sake
You and
and
me
for
both,
your
Sammy.
business.
You and me both.
I am curious, what kind of work are you all doing, or do you even have to do on the sell side to educate farmers about the economic picture in order to get them to buy the cover crop seed? Or do you feel like most of your customers are already bought in and it's easy to make the sale?
Yeah, that's a great question. In our initial years, we didn't have to do a lot of marketing. Well, I should say this. We didn't have to do a lot of what would be considered traditional marketing. We have always been very heavily focused on education. And so, we just did our field days last year. And so that's the 16th or 17th year in a row where we've had a big field day and brought people in and showed what we're doing and, got them out in the field. And, so we've always been big on that. This soil health resource guides that you see in the background here, we publish 30,000 of those every year, and we give them all away to free to people. And they've got really high quality articles from, industry experts in there. We spend a lot of our marketing budget on education. And initially that's all we spent it on. We didn't have to do any other types. But again, when you're small, it doesn't take a big increase to, consume your ability to grow. And so, as we've grown in our marketing as well, to where, we're doing social media and we're doing, lots of stuff with the website and digital ads and, all those other marketing channels and strategies as well. But it's still largely education based, because we're convinced that if a farmer understands how the soil is functioning and how plants and microbiology, how that all works together, and especially how the diversity of these things, how that makes the system so resilient. If they truly understand that, the only conclusion you can come to is that you have to have plants growing out there as often as possible, and preferably a great diversity of plants And in most situations, the only way that that makes sense to implement is through using cover crops and particularly these diverse mixes. And so, we want farmers to sell to themselves. One of the, it's called the Little Red Book of Selling. We've gone through it a couple times that they're selling with their sales team. And the quote I just love out of there is people love to buy, but they hate to be sold to. And so that's what we want. We want to encourage them to buy or to go out and seek these solutions, but they don't want to be sold to. None of us want to be sold to. You never want to feel like, you don't want to have that used car type experience. It's just this high pressure type sales. We're not about that. We want to educate people and then, let them make the decision of, I need to do this in order to make my system work the way that I want it to. And that's relatively easy to do with the innovators and with the early adopters. It's becoming more difficult as you move into the early majority. And that's where you have to start employing, some of the more traditional or creative marketing techniques, because you have to just go beyond just simply education, or at least you have to change how you're educating, because the innovators and early adopters, they'll come to you. These other guys, we've got to go to them. And that's a different strategy, and that's okay. But we just have to recognize that that's just different channels of marketing to reach them.
It sounds like you're alluding to Jeffrey Moore's classic Crossing the Chasm book. Mm-hmm. And one of the points that he makes in there is that moving the bridge from the early adopters to the early mainstream is personal references. And we see that a lot with producers, where they look for those personal references among producers that they know in their region. I'm curious how you think about that. Are you actively sort of activating a network? Or are you just sort of letting the word of mouth do its thing?
Yeah, good question. Certainly, we love word of mouth. We encourage people to do that. We've been trying to, when we are working with an existing customer, we try to, hey, do you have a neighbor? Do you have anybody else that you think would be interested? We'd love to talk to them. And it, honestly, if we can get more people in the same area to do it, everybody saves on shipping, because, shipping this cover crop seed is a big part of the expense. But if I can ship, Sammy and Patrick, if you guys are neighbors and you're each getting, 5,000 pounds, well, I can ship 10,000 pounds to you much cheaper than sending you each 5,000. Mm-hmm. And so if we can build some community there, it's going to save everybody some money on the shipping part. Plus, it leads to more sales, and you can build a nice little hub there. And we know that it kind of grows out from there, because, yeah, absolutely. The best way a farmer is convinced is by seeing it actually happening right in their neighborhood, especially if it's with with a neighbor that they really respect. And sometimes they won't actually go ask about that, but they're looking. They're always looking. Farmers are always looking and watching, and it may be after dark when they're going out there looking, but I promise you they're looking. So yeah, we try to leverage that. We try to do a lot of, again, whether it's field days or conferences. We put on our own conference at our Southeast Kansas location. That'll be coming up in December. We do a couple of kind of high level events that we call the Regenerative Nexus Summits. We do one in Scottsdale, Arizona, and one in Omaha. And that's tailored more towards, some of the, top tier regenerative farmers to come together and learn from each other. It's kind of a users group type thing, to where they can learn from each other and encourage each other. And hopefully they will go back and share what they've learned with their community back home. But you're right. That's exactly the best, that's the most effective marketing. It's way better than a Google ad, or it's way better than a Facebook post or anything else. And you can't really buy that. You can't really buy that. You just have to earn it through, servicing that customer really well, getting them to agree and buy into the brand that you've created, the culture that you have, the values that you have, and the value proposition that you brought to them, and then let them go out and share that. It's hard. Within the business industry, there's, what's called the Net Promoter Score. A lot of companies will collect that. And it's just one simple question. How likely are you to recommend this product to a friend? 1 through 10. And the only thing that counts positive for you are 9s and 10s. If somebody says a 7 or an 8, that doesn't count for you positive or negative. If it's a 6 or under, it detracts from your score. So only 9s and 10s are counted. So it's kind of a high bar to get to. In an industry standard, I think 40, 50, percent of 9s and 10s. We're typically running 70s and 80s, which is really good. And again, that's important to us because that means you are both supplying a quality product as well as quality service. And that's a reflection of that. So that's what we try to do. And then let those net promoters go out and tell other people about it.
From talking about your business to sort of expanding the aperture a little bit to talk about the cover crop market, it seems like a lot of the cover crop seeds now are single species, single variety. And clearly you started with a focus on diverse species and diverse mixes.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about the evolution of the market? And it seems like some of the challenges and headwinds that adoption is seen is related to single variety trials.
Yeah. I probably have to be careful how I say this. From a research perspective, if a university or other entity is doing research on cover crops, it is incredibly hard to do research on diverse mixes because if it makes a difference, and I had a 12-way species, what do you attribute the increase to? Was it the vetch? Was it the peas? Was it the oats? Was it the radish? Was it the sunflower? Was it the flax? I don't know, because I've got all these variables. And so that's really difficult for a lot of pure researchers to wrap their head around. They want to just plant rye. So now if they see a difference, they can say, this is the difference that the rye made. And yeah, they're right. But that's not how natural systems work. To do systems level research is much more difficult than single variable, reductionist type research. But that's what the farmers need, and that's what the farmers want. And so it's been difficult to get a lot of good research on the diverse mixes. And then you go even further and you say, okay, well, was it the plants or was it the interaction of the plants that was affecting the biology? And then that biology is what really made this change happen. Well, that's even harder. And so it just gets, again, it's not super complicated, but it's very complex. And in order to try to break that down, to have any type of research that's publishable and, advance your career, I get it. It's hard. It's going to be difficult to do that. And so that's why you see a lot of research done on single species type things, but they're not finding the same results that farmers are seeing in the field with these diverse mixes. Because again, there's interactions that are happening within that diverse community, and especially the interactions between the plants and the microbiome that you can't quantify in a lab or in a greenhouse or in a single species experiment, especially if it's done in land on a research farm that has been farmed conventionally for many years. And oh, by the way, now we're going to do regenerative research. That's so much different than land that's been farmed regeneratively for 5 years, 6 years, and now we're seeing all these different things. And so there's just a lot of nuances around the research that you don't always see the same things that farmers are seeing in the field replicated at the research level. So there can be some really good farmer research. There's some really good stuff out there, but it has to be focused on the systems and not just on trying to isolate a variable. So that's one thing. Now, I will say this too. We love diversity, but it has to make sense. I'm not going to put 15 things in a cover crop mix if only 5 of them have a decent chance of working well based on, where you're at or what your goals are, or the time of the year that you're planting and things like that. So we love diversity when it makes sense, but we don't want to put diversity out there just for the sake of having a number. And so there's 2 situations where your cover crop mixes will tend to be less diverse and maybe even a monoculture, which is still better than not doing anything. But when you run out of time, when your planting window, when your growing window is very short, there's just not a lot of things that are going to fit that window. And so, when we roll around to November 1st here in Nebraska, we're planting a lot of cereal rye by itself. And there's no shame in that because that's way better than doing nothing. But if I was planting September 1st and I was doing cereal rye by itself, well, I should be ashamed of myself because that's a great opportunity to include radishes and oats and peas and clover and all manner of other things that could work really well and give me some good benefits in that time frame. Whereas later in the winter, hey, cereal rye by itself, great option. Let's do it. So planting window short means less diversity. The other one is when your goal is super specific, when you are really focused in on just one thing. So, for example, an organic farmer says, hey, Keith, I've got to produce 200 pounds of nitrogen because I want to grow 220 bushel organic corn and I don't have access to chicken litter. I've got to have that nitrogen from my cover crop. Well, guess what? That cover crop is not going to be super diverse. We're going to focus in on the legumes that we know are going to survive, that they're going to really thrive in the time frame that he's given. And we can grow 200 pounds of nitrogen, but it's probably not going to be a super diverse mix. But it's the right mix because it's fitting the goals that that farmer had for that. And so those are the situations where we would tend to skew away from diversity and maybe even be a monoculture. But in other situations, we feel like there's a lot of opportunity to be diverse. And just because I'm super diverse doesn't mean it's super expensive. We've done, 12, 15, 18 way mixes for people, and it's still only been like $25 an acre because some of these things I don't have to put, pounds and pounds of things in with some of these, that are just really great companion type crops, like flax, for example. I don't need a lot of it in there. And so I'll put that in at very low inclusion rate so it doesn't increase the cost a great deal. And when you do it right, you can really have some nice diversity without being super expensive.
That in sharing that, you touched on the variables farmers are weighing. How long of a planting period do you have for this? What are we talking about in terms of winter conditions? How much nitrogen are you trying to put back in the soil? Like all these different variables, which is quite a big equation to weigh when you're making a decision like this. How much do you see on your own farm or with the farmers you're working with that this is an economic decision versus a more of an agronomic or even just like sort of mechanical decision of when I can get into my fields and not? Yeah. How would you describe this as an economic decision or otherwise?
Yeah. Well, I think it's almost always an economic decision. It should be, again, if these things don't pay for themselves, there's no amount of funding, there's no amount of incentives that will keep people doing this for the long term. Sure, we can get them to do it for a year, 2 years, 3 years, whatever that is. But if they don't see that they're getting a return on that investment, and this is with any input, they shouldn't be doing it. I mean, that's just bad business. To be putting in an input where you're not getting a positive return on investment. And sometimes the return on investment is not necessarily an increased yield. Sometimes it's in better plant health. Sometimes it's in, reduced disease pressure. And, there's lots of things that go into the economic decisions that aren't just based on yield. And frankly, that's one of the most frustrating things with the way a lot of people think. And I know why they think this way, and I'll explain that. So often it's all about yield. Is this going to increase my yield? What will this do to my yield? Where really we need to be thinking about how will this affect my profitability? What's the bottom line? What's the return on the investment? And the reason that as farmers, we so often think about yield, well, a couple of reasons, it's bragging rights at the coffee shop, of course, you got to be the guy that had the biggest yield in there. But really, a lot of it boils down to the federal crop insurance program, because crop insurance is based on yield, and your guarantees are based on your historical yields that you've grown. Has nothing to do with your profitability, but your coverages are all based on that historical yield. And so that's why yield is so heavily incentivized and so heavily sought after, because if I can raise my yield, my guaranteed yield, it raises the floor of my protection every year. And that's a really valuable thing. And I don't blame people for doing that. We think about that on our own ground too. But when you do that, it's 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 market manipulation. You're no longer making decisions based on the agronomic considerations, because now I'm looking at doing things simply for this artificial market that I wouldn't have normally done if that wasn't there. And so, I'm not saying we need to get rid of crop insurance, because it's a tool, it's a valuable tool, we need it. But I think there has to somehow be some modifications made to where, could I be incentivized more to grow 170 bushel corn that's very profitable versus 220 bushel corn where I'm barely breaking even because I had to put all these additional inputs to get that extra 50 bushels. It happens all the time. But the 220 is a way better thing for my crop insurance than the 170. And so in the long run, the guys might say, yeah, I'm going to spend the money to get the 220 because I need to keep my production history higher. And so that's one of the hard things for people to think about is, can I put in an input that doesn't necessarily increase my yield, but it will decrease my cost? Because that's a hard thing to think about. Even if I have a lower yield goal, but I have a higher profit goal, it's a paradigm shift in thinking that a lot of people struggle with. And so the economic decisions are it's going to be based on yield, but it's also looking at, can I reduce my inputs? And so with cover crops, we see cover crops pay for themselves. We see a return on investment in cover crops in multiple ways. Easiest way, especially right now, with margins being very, very tight or non-existent or maybe negative in corn and beans, they're great in cattle right now. So anybody with cattle, you plant a cover crop, you've got an extra 2 tons of forage out there. And I mean, cattle, you can put feeders out on that next spring and they can gain 3 pounds a day, and that gain's worth $3.50. Wow, that's easy math. Anybody can do that math. That's going to pay off incredibly. Now, there'll be a time when that turns and, cattle will be tighter and all that. But so right now, the ability to put pounds on animals or get grazing days for stock, that's the easiest return on investment that you can come. Now, not everybody has livestock, so that can't be the only thing. The second thing would probably be the reduction of inputs, particularly fertility. And so when we're growing something with legumes, or we're enhancing our soil biology to where we get more of this natural fixation of nitrogen, we've got, there's 30,000 tons of nitrogen above every acre of crop ground. It's just not available to the plants, but it is available to a lot of the biology. So if we can bring the biology in to make that available to plants, to the cover crops, and then the cover crops cycle it into the next crop, what's the value of if I could produce 40, 50, 60, 80, 200 pounds of nitrogen? What's that value to that next crop? So, that people can start to kind of put the numbers together on the nutrient, particularly that nitrogen fixation, and then other other nutrients. Our soil is made up of all of these minerals, phosphorus and potassium and calcium. A lot of these things that we add to our soils, they're in our soil. They're just not in a form that plants can get to. So we need to recruit the biology that makes them available to the plants. And the best way to recruit the biology is to get the right plants to do that. And again, that's where cover crops have a bit of a superpower, because if you plant the right cover crops to recruit the right biology, to cycle the right nutrients, and that all has to happen prior to the crop that you need to get those nutrients into. And so you really have to be thinking multiple steps ahead. Again, it's not complicated, but it's really complex. And you got to think about what you want and then be thinking back 6, 9 months, 12 months even, to how are you going to set up your system to get what you want. So the nutrients would be another one. Weed suppression and the reduced use of herbicides would be another one that is becoming more and more prevalent, especially as there's more and more herbicide resistant weeds that are out there, and guys are struggling, spraying 3, 4, 5 times and still not controlling some of these weeds. Cover crops aren't necessarily going to prevent those weeds, but they are a important tool in the system that will help you control those. So Yeah, I mean, I guess this is kind of what the podcast is about. I could talk about these economic benefits all day long. Those are probably the main immediate impact type ones that people can see and that people can actually put a pencil to. Okay, I got $30 worth of cover crop. I got $30 of planting. Where do I get my $60 back from? Well, if I can reduce my nutrients by $30 and reduce, my fertility, or by herbicides, one less spraying. And so those are the numbers that people start to go through. The things that are a little bit more difficult to quantify are things like, what's the value of not letting your soil wash away?
Mm-hmm.
We know that's valuable. It's hugely valuable. But because erosion happens at, small scale continually, unless it's this giant event where you just see these big gullies wash, you don't really notice it, but it's still happening if you don't have that soil covered somehow. So getting people to see and understand the value of saved soil is a huge part. Infiltration is another one. Infiltration tests are easy to do. And if we can save, 2-3 inches of water throughout the course of a growing season, and that might just simply be one big rain. You get one big 3-inch rain, good soils can take it all. Poor soils might only take 1 inch. Well, there's 2 inches that got away from you. What's the value of those 2 inches of moisture that I got into my soil for growing a crop later in the season? Easily could pay for $60 worth of cover crop and drilling with those 2 inches of water, easily. And so again, those are things that you have to think through a little bit more of going. Can I set myself up for these better benefits down the road? It's not a guarantee, but I think most people understand that our rainfall events are typically coming less frequently and are more intense. So the need to be able to capture and store that is greater than it's ever been.
Following up on that, one of the major levers that a lot of folks on the corporate side are starting to think about in terms of investing in their agricultural supply chains is risk reduction and resilience. You mentioned infiltration, so resilience to extreme weather events, whether that's floods or droughts or heat. Can you talk about what you're seeing broadly among your customer base with that?
Yeah. So, the risk reduction, again, it really comes back to how well are cover crops managed within the system. My friend Steve Groff, who's kind of a pioneer in the cover crop movement, he has a saying. He said, cover crops will make a good farmer better and a bad farmer worse. And really what he means by that, it's not that you're a good or bad farmer, but it's all about management. If you manage cover crops really well, it will make you better. If you manage them poorly or don't manage them at all, it will come back and bite you in the butt at some point. Maybe not every year, but at some point, particularly around timing on termination. If you have cover crops that overwinter, the timing of terminating those before your next crop is super critical. You can do it too soon and you can do it too late. And again, there's no formula. This is where it becomes as much of an art as it is a science. And farming in general is this way too, in that you have to be able to understand the environmental conditions that you have been given. You have to look into the future a little bit. Now, of course, we know that weather reports aren't super accurate, but they're better than they've ever been. So I think it's better than it was 20 years ago, more reliable information. And so if it looks like it's going to be a dry spring, we'll terminate our cover crops earlier because we want to conserve and preserve the moisture there. If it looks like it's going to be a wet spring, or I'm further east in the Corn Belt where they almost always have wet springs, that cover crop growing and pulling the moisture out of the top of the soil profile allows them to get in and plant much sooner than their conventionally tilled neighbors. So, it's the management of these cover crops that directly affect the risk impact that they're going to have. So I can't really say that cover crops will bring less risk to your operation. I think they will if they're properly managed. I think they bring more risk if they're not managed at all or they're not properly thought through, because again, it can make you either better or worse depending on that level of management that you apply. Now, certainly as we build organic matter, we know for sure that soils with higher organic matter levels, they're just simply more resilient to everything. they're more resilient to a drought. They're just naturally going to have higher infiltration rates. They've got higher levels of just native nutrient cycling. All of these things are, as you build organic matter, all these good benefits happen. And so if I'm in a system, a regenerative system, of which cover crops are a part, not the only tool, but in conjunction with good rotation and livestock integration and, reduced disturbance and all these things, if I'm in this system and I'm growing my organic matter, and we've seen pretty consistently across our own farm and others, we can reliably grow a 1/10% of organic matter a year. May not sound like very much, but if you can gain a full percent of organic matter in a 10-year period, that is a win. That is a huge deal. That is a game changer, and that totally transforms, your soil. And you do that for 20 years and you increase it by 2%. I mean, it just builds upon itself. It's compounding and cascading on these benefits. And so if we can do that, there is no doubt those soils will be much more resilient and have far less risk than something that has, something with 3% is way better than something with 1%. But crop insurance doesn't take that into account. And so as we make our soils healthier, as we build the organic matter, as we build our aggregate stability and soil structure, as we build the biological community, all of these things lead to a more resilient system. And when it's more resilient, it will always have less risk. And the ultimate thing on having less risk is having that livestock integration. Gabe Brown said, I never had a crop failure because he always had livestock. He had plenty of crops that he never harvested because he had hail or because he had drought or all of these things. But if he could graze his cattle through there, he still considered that to be of some benefit. And so people with livestock have a lot more ability to go to plan B or plan C or plan D than the folks that don't have livestock. So can these lead to less risk? Absolutely they can, but you've got to manage them properly if you're going to achieve those levels.
And it sounds like we need to overhaul the way we ensure risk to really create change on how risk is actually, decisions about risk are made at the farm level.
Yeah, I definitely think so, because right now the least risky thing to do is to continue doing what you've always done. Some people say our agricultural system is broken, but I've heard others say it's not really broken because we're really getting the results that the system was designed to create. It may not be the right system, but it's not a broken system. It's working actually pretty effectively.
Right.
But if we want to change the results, we're probably going to have to change the system to some extent in order to shift those outcomes. And I don't know what that looks like. Again, crop insurance is a tool. It certainly would be a disaster to take that away. So whatever changes that are going to be made need to be made, smartly and cautiously. But I don't think we can continue to just go about the same way that we've been doing it and expect to get different results.
You alluded to the fact that it's hard to study the effect. Academics find it challenging to study the effect of a multi-species cover. And it seems like, your emphasis now on management decisions, it seems so much of this is an art versus a science. It's non-deterministic biological systems versus deterministic industrial systems. And the financing system and the insurance system are all built around deterministic systems. I've thought for a while that, one of the big challenges with regen is it's basically about scaling wisdom and scaling judgments that are made in these complex systems. I'm curious if you can talk to that a little bit. Like, how do you scale wisdom?
That's an interesting concept. How do we scale wisdom? Well, certainly knowledge, can build upon each other, and we can have knowledge databases, and, I can go out and I can read a book, and I can take advantage of the knowledge that other people have accumulated. But in order to take advantage of their wisdom, I have to have more of a connection with them somehow, because, wisdom is the real world application of the knowledge. And there is a difference. And so I think the best way to scale the wisdom is to build networks and to build communities where we can get the interaction between those that have, I don't want to say figured it out, but those that have been in the trenches long enough that they've learned a lot of things the hard way. That's hard fought wisdom and oftentimes expensive earned wisdom. How do we get them to transfer that to other people in a significant and meaningful way? And not just in a book, but in a meaningful relationship, in a meaningful situation. So I think mentoring programs can be hugely successful. And I know there's a lot of different programs out there that, try to match up a beginning regenerative farmer with a more experienced one. And when those programs are ran right, they're incredible. I mean, it's the absolute best way to transfer that wisdom is to have that one-on-one or one-on small group type relationship where that can be shared and that can be transferred. Now that may not be as scalable as somebody, Joel Salatin going to an auditorium and speaking to 1,000 people. There's some of that transferred that way, but again, it's when Joel Salatin has a small group in to tour his farm and they get to have those intimate conversations and, they're right there in the field and they're asking him all the questions. I think that's where a lot more of that wisdom is going to be transferred and moved across to other generations. So I guess that's kind of my take on it. It's really going to boil down to reestablishing those relationships and communities. And, John Kempf and I have had this conversation in the past about, how regenerative farming is different than soil health. You've got the 6 principles of soil health. I think most people would agree that, you follow these things, you're going to make your soil healthier. It's going to be a good benefit. But those are not the same thing as the principles of regenerative agriculture, because regenerative agriculture encompasses so much more than just soil health. It's about regenerating the soil, yes, but it's also about regenerating and restoring these relationships between these farmers, whether they're neighbors or whether, it's, like I had a tour group in from Missouri today, and I've got a group of farmers from the Ukraine coming later this week. And, I'll spend half a day taking them around and showing them what we've done and showing them what we built and what we've learned. That's part of what we do to give back because we've been given a lot in the first place. And so that's part of how we're doing that. But that's part of the regenerative agriculture movement is regenerating the relationships between neighbors, between people in the land, between people and our creators. It's rebuilding community. It's all of those things. And, if you just simply are looking at numbers, it's hard to put a value on some of those things. But I tell you what, that's what separates the regenerative farmer from the conventional farmer more so than the agronomy. It's that mindset of wanting to transfer whatever wisdom or knowledge or experience I have to someone else. And I promise you, as you get to know these regenerative folks, they are so much more sharing. They're so much more willing to say, come in and see what I've been doing. Let me tell you about the mistakes that I've made. This didn't work for me, and here's why I don't think it did. They're very willing to share that information. They're very willing to give and to transfer that wisdom. You're not going to get that in a book. And so that has to be from the regeneration of relationships and the restoration of community.
Yeah, I love John's quote that regeneration is the restoration of relationship, which is, of course, fractal, right? From the relationship of the microbiology to the relationship in the community to the relationship writ large. I also wonder about the role of data. We can't, there's a risk of being reductionistic in this.
Yeah.
And at the same time, like, how do we translate the beauty of these multivariate outcomes and solutions to those that underwrite capital? And, currently the data, we were talking about academia, but the same is also true of corporate capital allocation or investor capital allocation or lenders and insurance underwriters. The anecdotes that we have around these things, around the economic benefits and the agronomic benefits, are amazing. But it seems like we have a big gap around the data that can help translate to these other stakeholders.
Yes. And so, data is going to be incredibly valuable. In fact, I've heard, people say that may be the most valuable commodity we produce down the road. I don't know. I guess it depends on who's looking for what data, but I think a lot of the data around regenerative agriculture, I think it's incomplete data sets yet right now, partly because we don't have the right sensor technology or the right testing technology to really truly get the rich data sets. I mean, how we're just in the infancy of some of the DNA sequencing when you send in a soil test and you get this mile long list of all of the species of organisms that are there. But when you talk to the scientists, they'll tell you there is a whole bunch of that DNA that they cannot identify because they don't have something in their library to match it to. And so, yeah, it's a data set, but it's not complete. And so I think that we're going to continue to see better data, better regenerative data come. Sure, we can measure biomass, and there's a lot of things we can measure, but there's a lot of things we can't measure quite yet. And for example, one of the things that I always ask these labs about is I say, okay, what I really want to know is, well, I'm growing corn. I really want to know specifically which biological organisms or which families of biology are really going to benefit that corn plant. And they know some of those, but it's not a complete set. So we know some of those. And then I say, then I want to know what root exudates really increase the populations of these specific families of biology. And then I want to know which cover crops produce those root exudates that produce that biology that benefits that corn crop. And if I know that, now I can really make the exact right cover crop mix to put ahead of corn. And it may be different for different people because you may need different nutrients cycled out, or you have different diseases you need to fight. It can be prescriptive, but we don't know all of these things. And so that's the data that I think will really start changing the game on things, is when we can, start to identify things at that molecular biological level and really analyze the root exudates of these plants and understand. Then we can understand how this cover crop is going to affect that cash crop with the biological bridge that comes in between. That would be huge. I mean, that would be Sammy, that would increase demand for cover crops exponentially, because now people can directly tie that, to, if I do this, I'm going to get this because of this biological bridge. And here's the data that shows it. Right now, we're putting things out that we visually can see are having a positive impact, but we can't see the data. We can't see the things that are going on in the soil that's actually making that happen. So I do think data is going to be important, but I think the regenerative data that we need to collect is probably not really well developed yet. I think it will come. The technological advances in sensors has been really, really good, and we're going to get more sensors, and they're going to get much cheaper. And the ability to, have sensors, at individual plant levels and, in the soil, because a lot of this sensing has to take place, within the system. You can't rip something up and send it to the lab and expect to get real world results. So, that sensing has to be taking place within the system itself. I don't think we're there yet, but we're getting there. And then, it's going to take AI and big computers and stuff to analyze all that data and sort it out and figure it out and do the example of what I said, about planting the right cover crops to get the right root exudates to encourage the right biology to really benefit now my cash crop that I'm doing over here. So will that data be valuable? You bet it will be. And if whoever can figure out how to collect that, that's going to be worth some money.
Thank you, Keith. That does sound amazing as a future state. As we wrap up here, we're pulling to a close. We can't scale your wisdom, but this episode might help it reach folks that are making important decisions, whether that's investing in regenerative agriculture companies or choosing which cover crops to plant on their farm. So given that, what are some parting thoughts else that you want to share with our audience today?
Yeah, great question. I just encourage people to take accountability for your own learning experience, for your own learning journey. And that might be, going to conferences. It might be listening to lots of great podcasts like this, or watching webinars, or seeking out these people that have this wisdom. You can't expect them to come to you. You've got to, they're going to be willing to share, but you got to put the effort into finding them and reaching out and getting out there. So, but you have to take the responsibility and accountability for doing that. So be proactive, find people that you can learn from, and then start experimenting, do some wild and crazy things on a really small scale. Because if you're doing, some experiments, whether it be with cover crops or biologicals or any of these things, you don't have to do it on a very big area to really get a good understanding of whether or not that might work or not. So, it might be half an acre or an acre or whatever it is, but start doing some things that are pushing the boundaries, pushing the limits. Maybe it's something you saw someone else doing and you want to see how it works on your farm. Or maybe it's something that somebody tried and it didn't work, but you think you can tweak it a little bit and maybe it would work or have a little different conditions. Whatever it is, be trying something. And try it at small enough scales to where really your only risk is the time you have invested. And it's not necessarily, don't risk the farm. Don't bet the farm on an unproven concept on your farm. It may be proven somewhere else, but that doesn't mean it's proven on your operation. But if you don't try something, you're not going to learn anything. And so we just really encourage people to get creative and then be willing to share that information with others, with your neighbors, with the people that you went and talked to in the first place. What a great thing to do if you have a mentor, to be able to go back to that mentor next year and say, hey, here's what I tried. Here's what I found. Help me think through what this means. They will absolutely love that. And they may even learn something along the way as well. And then that's just going to continue to build those relationships and build that community. So that would be my advice: is be proactive, take responsibility for your own learning, and get out there and try stuff.
I love that. That's so motivating. Well, thank you so much for being here with us today, Keith. It was truly a pleasure to have you.
Thanks, Sammy. Thank you, Patrick. Appreciate
Thank you,
it.
Keith. Really enjoyed talking to you. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Business of Soil Health. Our goal is to explore how new financial tools may or may not support producers' stewardship of their soil. We love hearing from listeners, so don't hesitate to reach out with any suggestions or guests you'd like for us to feature. And don't forget to subscribe or leave a review on your favorite podcast platform.